Something exploded in Shiraz this morning, and the explanation that matters is not the one Iran's government is offering, the official framing, the one that Iranian state media has deployed with the practiced reflexivity of an apparatus that has been manufacturing explanations for inconvenient explosions since the first mysterious incident in the IRGC's supply chain, is a gas leak. Some facility, some infrastructure, some mundane industrial accident in a country that has been at war for months, that is operating its energy and industrial infrastructure under conditions of extreme resource stress, that has been cutting maintenance budgets to fund a military campaign, and that has experienced a remarkable number of gas leaks, specifically in locations that happen to correspond to weapon storage facilities, underground missile complexes, and IRGC operational infrastructure. A remarkable number of gas leaks, with a remarkable geographic distribution, over a remarkably compressed timeline. But this morning's explosion in Shiraz is not being assessed as a gas leak by anyone with access to the operational picture of what Iran has been doing in the ceasefire period. Shiraz is the home of significant portions of Iran's underground missile storage and production infrastructure. The Fars province facilities in and around Shiraz represent one of the nodes in the IRGC's distributed underground missile city architecture. The same architecture that the New York Times assessment published yesterday reveals is currently being excavated, dug out, and made operational at rates that suggest the IRGC is not preparing to negotiate. It is preparing to resume fighting. And when you are digging out ballistic missiles from underground storage facilities that have been sitting dormant under wartime conditions with aging propellants and degraded handling infrastructure, the specific category of accident that produces a massive blast at the site of your missile excavation operation is not a gas leak. It is a missile detonating. Stay with me. Because the Shiraz explosion, the New York Times intelligence assessment of Iran's retained missile capability, the 8 white unidentified aircraft that flew into Iranian territory with unknown cargo, the Chinese ships transiting the strait during the blockade while Trump is in Beijing meeting with Xi, the B-1B bombers running training sorties from England toward the Mediterranean, the Saudi strikes on Iranian-backed militias in southern Iraq, the UAE's steel cage anti-drone installations around its oil infrastructure, and Iran's propaganda spin on the Kuwait IRGC commando infiltration. All of it, when assembled into a complete picture on May 13th, 2026, tells a story that the individual headlines are not individually communicating with sufficient clarity. The story is this. The ceasefire is functioning as a preparation window for both sides simultaneously, and the side that has been using that window more aggressively to rebuild its offensive capability has a very large explosion in Shiraz this morning to show for the effort. Let us start with the intelligence assessment, because the New York Times report published on May 12th, sourced from people with knowledge of a military intelligence assessment based on multiple collection streams including satellite imagery and surveillance technology, is the most specific publicly available picture of Iran's retained military capability since Operation Epic Fury began, and its numbers are considerably more significant than the coverage has treated them. Iran retains approximately 70% of its pre-war mobile missile launcher inventory, 70%. Not the collapsed residual capability that the initial operational success of the American strike campaign suggested. Not the broken, depleted force that the IRGC's propaganda losses and the visible destruction of Bandar Abbas and Keshem and the other targeted facilities would imply. 70% of the mobile launchers, the specific asset category that makes ballistic missile operations survivable against air campaigns precisely because they are not fixed to locations that can be pre-targeted and destroyed before launch. Mobile launchers move. They hide in mountain terrain. They disperse into the civilian infrastructure that international law makes difficult to strike preemptively. They are the reason that even a heavily degraded Iranian ballistic missile force is not a disarmed Iranian ballistic missile force. Iran retains approximately 70% of its pre-war ballistic missile stockpile, the missiles themselves, not just the systems that launch them, the weapons, the inventory that the IRGC has been spending the ceasefire digging out from the underground storage facilities that the intelligence assessment confirms Iran has regained 90% access to. 90%. Underground missile storage and launch facilities across the country assessed as partially or fully operational. The underground missile cities that were supposed to have been substantially eliminated in the May 7th and 8th counterattacks against the facilities that the IRGC's own attack signatures revealed, those underground facilities, apparently, have a survival rate that the operational planning did not fully account for. Let us be precise about what these numbers mean in terms of the operational threat picture. 70% of mobile launchers, 70% of pre-war missile stockpile, 90% access to underground storage. These are not the numbers of a force that has been broken by the first phase of American operations. They are the numbers of a force that absorbed a significant but incomplete first strike and retained the capacity for a second strike that, if properly coordinated and executed from the dispersed mobile positions that 70% launcher retention represents, could impose costs on American forces, Gulf state infrastructure, and commercial shipping in the strait that the current defensive architecture would have to work very hard to fully defeat. The Shiraz explosion this morning is the operational manifestation of these numbers. The IRGC has been spending the ceasefire digging out those missiles, moving them from the storage positions to launch-ready positions, assessing propellant condition, guidance system integrity, launcher mechanical readiness, all of the logistical and technical work that converting a stored stockpile into a ready force requires. And somewhere in that process, in a facility in or near Shiraz in Fars province, something went wrong. A propellant that had been sitting in storage under wartime conditions proved less stable than the handling assessment assumed. A warhead that had been moved from one position to another experienced the specific mechanical stress that its technical handling protocol was designed to prevent. The result was a massive blast at a location that the operational context of the IRGC's known excavation activities makes most plausible as a missile storage or preparation facility. This is not speculation. It is the application of the operational picture to the geographic fact of where the explosion occurred. Shiraz is not random. If the IRGC is digging out its underground missile inventory, and the intelligence assessment confirms that it is, and an explosion occurs in Shiraz, which hosts significant portions of that underground missile infrastructure, the most operationally coherent explanation for the explosion is the activity the intelligence assessment confirms is underway. The gas leak explanation is available. It is the explanation that costs the Iranian government nothing to offer, and that foreign governments cannot disprove without disclosing the intelligence sources that tell them something different. Now let us go to China. Because what is happening with Chinese weapons deliveries to Iran while Trump is in Beijing meeting with Xi Jinping is the most operationally significant development on the diplomatic track since the ceasefire began, and the timing creates a diplomatic constraint on the American military response that the IRGC's operational planning is almost certainly incorporating. Chinese companies have been engaging in discussions over potential arms sales to Iran. That is the New York Times formulation, carefully worded, sourced to the level of documentation that the paper's editorial standards require. The operational reality that the available evidence describes is considerably more direct than discussions. 8 mysterious all-white aircraft entered Iranian airspace during the ceasefire period. Their origin was assessed as either Russia or China. Their cargo was not confirmed publicly. The operational context of the ceasefire period, the IRGC's active missile excavation program, its documented requests for Chinese upgraded electro-optical air defense sensors, the Chinese cargo ships that have been maintaining transit through the strait at rates that the blockade has not fully interdicted, all of that context makes the most operationally coherent assessment of those 8 white aircraft's cargo, one that a foreign ministry press release will never confirm, and that the intelligence agencies tracking the activity have been briefing to decision makers in the form that their collection sources allow. China has been supplying Iran with weapons components during the ceasefire. Not through a formal military supply relationship announced through official channels, through the gray market, through third-party commercial entities, through the specific mechanisms that the Chinese state's relationship with its commercial sector allows it to exploit when it wants the operational benefit of a supply relationship without the diplomatic visibility that a direct state-to-state arms transfer would create. The stopped Chinese ship, the vessel that American forces intercepted and boarded in international waters carrying cargo that the manifest did not accurately describe, is the visible tip of the supply relationship that the 8 white aircraft and the increased Chinese shipping activity represent. Multiple cargo vessels and oil tankers linked to China transited the Strait of Hormuz in the 24-hour window spanning May 12th and 13th. The timing is the complication. Trump is currently in Beijing. He is in the Great Hall of the People, or its immediate diplomatic environs, meeting with Xi Jinping about trade, Taiwan, Iran, and the full range of great power bilateral concerns. Boarding another Chinese ship in the strait during the presidential visit would generate the kind of immediate bilateral crisis that creates diplomatic shrapnel, not in the long-term strategic sense, where boarding Chinese ships that are supplying Iran with weapons components is clearly the correct operational decision, but in the immediate tactical sense of what it does to the room temperature of a summit meeting that the administration needs to produce specific outcomes on the Iran file. The constraint is real. You cannot board a Chinese ship in the Strait of Hormuz while the President of the United States is sitting across a table from the leader of China in Beijing and expect the meeting to continue at the temperature required to produce the co-signing of American red lines on Iran that the summit's first session has reportedly achieved. The IRGC's operational planning understands this constraint. The acceleration of Chinese supply activity in the window coinciding with the Beijing summit is not a coincidence. It is the strategic exploitation of a diplomatic constraint that Iranian intelligence assessed correctly would limit American interdiction activity during the meeting window. This is the specific problem that the boardings while Trump is in Beijing calculation creates. If the Chinese supply activity succeeds in moving significant weapons components into Iran during the summit window, the operational picture when Trump returns and the diplomatic constraint is lifted has changed. Not dramatically in the case of individual shipments, but directionally in the sense that every component that reaches Iranian territory during the constraint window is a component that is available to the IRGC's reconstitution effort and unavailable to the American interdiction operation that would have stopped it. The summit that produces the Iran co-signing on the diplomatic track is simultaneously providing a window for the supply activity that the co-signing is supposed to prevent. The B-1B bomber training sorties from England tell the same story that every pre-operational military preparation signal has been telling for the past week, just from a different geographic starting point. B-1B Lancers and B-52 Stratofortresses positioned in England conducting training sorties that route through European airspace toward the Mediterranean, the direction of the Middle East operational theater, are doing exactly what the pre-operation Epic Fury period showed they do when the order to execute is approaching. They train. They maintain the specific mission proficiency that makes the difference between an execution that achieves its objectives and an execution that encounters the kind of performance shortfall that degraded readiness produces. Multiple B-1Bs in the air simultaneously. Training sorties specifically described as simulated attack flights toward the relevant geographic direction. The pattern is identical to what the pre-operation Epic Fury period produced. Constant training. Constant readiness maintenance. The answer to why they are constantly training is the answer that the B-1B's mission profile in this theater makes obvious. The GBU-72 advanced bunker penetrating weapon that the B-1B delivers against hardened underground facilities is the specific capability required to address the 90% access that the intelligence assessment confirms Iran has regained to its underground missile storage network. If the order comes down that striking those facilities is the next operational phase, the B-1Bs in England need to be at the specific mission proficiency that the training sorties are building and maintaining. They are building and maintaining it. The conclusion about why follows logically. Saudi Arabia's operational involvement in this conflict has now expanded beyond the confirmed strikes on Iranian territory to confirmed strikes on Iranian-backed militias in southern Iraq, near the Iraq-Saudi border. The Reuters report, sourced to people familiar with the matter, provides the specific operational detail that the earlier Saudi confirmation lacked. Not just strikes on Iran directly, but strikes on the Iraqi proxy network that Iran has maintained as a strategic depth layer, positioning militia forces in Iraqi territory adjacent to Saudi Arabia as a mechanism for projecting threat to Saudi infrastructure from a direction that the main Iran-Saudi military confrontation framework might not prioritize. The timing of some of those strikes in close proximity to the commencement of the nominal U.S.-Iran ceasefire suggests that the Saudi operational planning was calibrated to the same window that the ceasefire announcement created, a window in which the diplomatic attention was focused on the ceasefire framework, while the operational activity of eliminating the most immediate proxy threats continued under the cover of the framework's ambiguity about what constitutes a ceasefire violation. This is the actual Saudi Arabia that is operating in this conflict. Not the publicly neutral, carefully hedged partner that Riyadh's official communications describe, but an active military participant that has been striking Iranian targets and Iranian proxy targets since the conflict began, coordinating its operations with the American timeline, and now being confirmed through Reuters sourcing as a genuine coalition combatant, rather than a diplomatically constrained observer. The implications for the post-conflict regional security architecture are significant. Saudi Arabia that has struck Iranian territory and Iranian proxy forces in Iraq is Saudi Arabia whose relationship with Iran in the post-conflict period cannot return to the pre-conflict equilibrium. The covert strikes are now being confirmed publicly. The confirmation changes the diplomatic landscape in which any post-conflict Iran-Saudi relationship would have to be constructed. The UAE's steel cage anti-drone installations at oil storage sites are the operational infrastructure of an institution that has made its assessment about what the next phase of this conflict will bring, and is preparing accordingly. Massive steel scaffolding above oil tank farms, not the lightweight netting that Russia installed at its pipeline infrastructure and that Ukraine's heavy attack drones flew through without difficulty, but engineering-grade, heavy steel structures capable of stopping the Shahed-class heavy one-way attack drones that the IRGC has been using as its primary retaliatory instrument against Gulf state infrastructure. The UAE lost significant oil infrastructure during the war and continued to absorb drone and missile strikes into the ceasefire period. The steel cage installations are not a precautionary hedge against a low-probability future threat. They are the preparation of a country that expects those threats to materialize in the near term and has decided to absorb the construction cost of meaningful protection rather than the operational cost of unprotected infrastructure damage. The urgency visible in the installation imagery, the pace and scale of the construction, the simultaneous deployment across multiple oil facility sites, is the urgency of an institution that has received intelligence about the IRGC's Martyr Commander exercise preparation and the excavation of underground missile stockpiles and the Chinese weapons supply activity during the Trump in Beijing window, and has concluded that the ceasefire's end is approaching on a timeline that the construction schedule must race to proceed. Iran's Foreign Minister Araghchi's statement about the Kuwait IRGC commando infiltration is the most transparent piece of propaganda inversion the conflict has yet produced and deserves to be examined specifically for what it reveals about the Iranian regime's information strategy when its operations fail. The IRGC deployed commandos to Bubiyan Island, a Kuwaiti military installation where American forces are operating, in an attempt to kill or capture American soldiers to create hostage leverage in the negotiations. The commandos were detected, engaged by Kuwaiti armed forces. One Kuwaiti military member was seriously injured, and the commandos were apprehended. This is the documented sequence of events that Kuwait's foreign ministry confirmed with the specific language of a government that has been attacked on its own territory and is invoking Article 51 of the UN Charter to reserve its right of response. Araghchi's counter-narrative that Kuwait unlawfully attacked an Iranian boat and detained 4 Iranian citizens near an island used by the United States to attack Iran is the specific inversion that the Iranian propaganda architecture applies when its covert operations are exposed and their personnel captured. The operation becomes a peaceful navigation. The commandos become innocent citizens. The armed confrontation becomes an unlawful attack. The demand is for immediate release of the detained personnel. The reservation of the right to respond is the threat that is supposed to create enough diplomatic uncertainty about further escalation that the hostage-taking that failed in the operation might be achievable through the diplomatic channel that the demand creates. This framing has a specific operational purpose beyond the obvious face-saving function. By characterizing the captured IRGC commandos as ordinary Iranian citizens unlawfully detained by Kuwait, Iran is attempting to create a diplomatic lever that the Kuwaiti government must address, either by releasing the prisoners and validating the Iranian framing, or by maintaining detention and accepting the IRGC's reserved right to respond as a credible threat against Kuwaiti interests. Neither option is comfortable for Kuwait, which is why the framing is designed the way it is. Kuwait's Article 51 invocation is the correct response. It establishes the legal framework for Kuwait's own military response to the infiltration without committing Kuwait to a specific operational action on a specific timeline. The international legal standing exists. The question of whether and when Kuwait exercises it remains open. CENTCOM's updated operational numbers, 67 commercial vessels redirected, 4 disabled for refusing to comply, tell the accumulating story of the blockade's sustained pressure in the specific language of documented operational activity. 67 redirected vessels is 67 cargo companies, 67 sets of charterers, 67 voyage plans that have been disrupted at a cost that the commercial shipping industry is absorbing while waiting for the operational and diplomatic environment to change in a way that makes straight transit commercially viable again. 4 vessels disabled for noncompliance is the documented record of what happens when vessels that have already received warnings choose not to comply. A record that every other ship captain in the region has available to inform their own calculation about whether compliance is the rational choice. The hype video footage that CENTCOM released alongside the updated numbers, door gunners locked and loaded, night vision Marines boarding a vessel, the visceral imagery of naval interdiction executed at operational tempo, is the information operation that accompanies the operational numbers. The numbers tell the financial story of the blockade's effect. The imagery tells the deterrence story of what non-compliance produces. Both together communicate to every ship owner, every charterer, every cargo company, and every flag state whose vessels might be considering whether the Chinese-linked ship's continued straight transit means the blockade has softened that it has not. The 67 redirected vessels are 67 times the blockade held. The 4 disabled vessels are 4 demonstrated consequences. The imagery is the documentary record of those consequences, available for any subsequent decision-maker to consult. Now let us assemble the complete picture of what May 13th, 2026 actually shows when all of these simultaneously developing threads are viewed against the backdrop of Trump's Beijing summit with Xi and what that summit has produced on the Iran file. The IRGC is digging out its missiles. The Shiraz explosion this morning is the most visible evidence that this activity is real, ongoing, and proceeding under conditions that involve enough operational risk to produce massive accidental detonations. The 70% launcher retention 70% stockpile retention, 90% underground facility access numbers from the New York Times intelligence assessment confirm the scale of what is being dug out. The B-1B training sorties from England confirm that American forces are maintaining the specific mission proficiency required to address what is being dug out. The UAE's steel cage installations confirm that the country with the most direct intelligence access to American operational planning is preparing for the IRGC to use what it is digging out. And the Martyr Commander exercise confirms that the IRGC intends to use it. China is supplying Iran with weapons components during the summit window, the 8 white aircraft with unconfirmed cargo, the Chinese ships transiting the strait during the blockade in the window that the Trump in Beijing diplomatic constraint has temporarily created for interdiction hesitation, the New York Times report on Chinese company arms sale discussions. All of this in the same window that the summit is reportedly producing China's co-signing of the American red lines on nuclear weapons and strait reopening. The gap between China's official diplomatic position, co-signing American red lines, and China's operational behavior, allowing or facilitating weapons supply to Iran during the window that those red lines are being co-signed, is the gap that the Beijing summit needs to close with actual enforcement mechanisms rather than bilateral statement language, if the co-signing is to produce the operational outcome that American strategy requires. Saudi Arabia has been confirmed as an active military participant in strikes against Iranian-backed militias in Iraq. The UAE has been confirmed as an active participant through the Lavon Island strike. Kuwait has invoked Article 51 after capturing IRGC commandos. France's carrier is in the operational theater. The coalition is larger and more operationally active than any public coalition framework has acknowledged. The IRGC's strategic planning, which was built around the assumption that the United States would face this confrontation essentially alone with tepid Gulf state cooperation, is operating against a reality in which Saudi Arabia is striking Iraqi militias, the UAE is hitting Iranian refineries, Kuwait is invoking the UN Charter's self-defense provision, and France is positioning Tiger helicopters with 30mm cannon capability in theater. The operational constraint that Trump's Beijing presence creates, the expectation that no major military action will resume while the president is overseas, the hesitation around boarding additional Chinese ships while the summit is producing the bilateral Iran co-signing that the administration needs, is real and finite. The summit concludes. Trump returns. The constraint lifts. And the 67 redirected vessels, the 4 disabled for noncompliance, the B-1Bs maintaining training readiness, the UAE's steel cages going up at oil tank farms, the 53 F-16s at Prince Sultan, and the B-1B sorties over the Mediterranean are all still in the same operational positions they occupied before the summit began, with the same capability and the same authorization framework, now augmented by a bilateral presidential agreement with China, co-signing the red lines that the operational architecture is designed to enforce. The IRGC's Shiraz explosion this morning is the sound of an institution that understands the constraint window is finite and is racing to make maximum use of it. It is moving missiles out of underground storage while the diplomatic attention is on Beijing. It is receiving whatever weapons components the Chinese supply channel can move through the strait in the window that the Trump in Beijing constraint creates. It is running Martyr Commander to maintain internal loyalty under the financial and institutional pressure that the blockade's $500 million daily loss is producing in the war chest. And it is offering propaganda inversions of the Kuwait infiltration because the actual operational content of the infiltration, IRGC commandos attempting to capture American soldiers during a ceasefire to create hostage leverage, is the story of an institution that has exhausted its conventional options and is reaching for the unconventional ones with the specific desperation that 40 days of oil storage countdown and Beijing's Iran co-signing create. The gas leak explanation for the Shiraz explosion is available. It costs nothing to offer. It cannot be disproven by anyone without access to the collection sources that tell a different story. But the operational context does not require disproving the gas leak explanation. It requires recognizing that the operational context makes one explanation overwhelmingly more consistent with the documented activity than the other. The IRGC is digging out missiles in Shiraz. Missiles in Shiraz have been known to explode when handled under conditions that include wartime stress, degraded maintenance infrastructure, aging propellants, and the kind of operational urgency that produces shortcuts in handling protocols. Something exploded in Shiraz this morning at a location that corresponds to missile storage infrastructure. The most operationally coherent explanation for the explosion is the activity that the intelligence assessment confirms is underway. The gas leak is available. The missile is the explanation that the operational context requires. Drop your prediction in the comments right now. Does the Trump in Beijing constraint window close before the Chinese weapon supply activity and the IRGC's missile excavation effort produce a restored capability that changes the strike calculus when the window lifts? Or does the summit produce the actual enforcement commitment from Beijing that closes the Chinese supply channel before it delivers enough to matter? And what does the Shiraz explosion this morning tell you about the pace at which the IRGC is trying to move through its excavation timeline relative to the pace at which the B-1Bs in England are maintaining the mission proficiency required to address what the excavation is uncovering? Subscribe right now and turn on notifications. The Shiraz explosion is not a gas leak. The B-1Bs are not on vacation. The Chinese ships are not carrying empty containers. And the summit in Beijing has a conclusion date. Stay informed. Stay ahead.